Thank you both for joining us. It is so sad, once again, that we are doing this virtually. I wanted to ask you both, you know, when I last did something for Korea, we all thought that by now the virus will have receded as a threat, but it's shown itself to be much more resilient than many of us had hoped. You've just had your membership meetings. What were the key takeaways from members as they thought about COVID? Has it affected their priorities for ESG?
Great question, and thank you for having us here today. It's a pleasure seeing you. I look forward to the time where I can see you in person rather virtually, and it's a pleasure to be back here at this really wonderful event. It's a real showcase for us to be able to spend some time with you today. It was a fascinating board meeting because it is such a remarkable time in our lives. And for the heads of the institutions that I have the pleasure of representing, it really is about changing the nature of the business model, that the way in which we function, right? Somewhere between 90 and 98% of our workforce is working from home, and may for an extended period of time, and maybe a large portion of that permanently. And that brings both opportunities in terms of where you hire and where you locate, but it also has challenges of operational risk and cybersecurity and issues about AML. So there's both pluses and minuses too. It's really accelerated the digitization process in terms of how we interact with our clients, how we interact internally, systems to put in place, migration to the cloud, how we employ artificial intelligence and other sort of cutting edge technologies to ensure that we can respond from wherever and do so quickly. With respect to priorities, we want to make sure that we're an active part of funneling capital into the real economy. You know, the great thing about us in this current crisis is we're part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so I think the industry globally has really stepped up and been a key intermediary in support of public programs, fiscal programs, and those run by central banks, whether it's liquidity or credit facilities. We were able to be the conduit for that, but also continuing to lend to our clients, keep open in a whole host of markets, and have really a long-term relationship with our members so we can keep capital going to the real economy. There is a big question mark about the trajectory of the economy globally and key markets. That's really a function of how we address this healthcare crisis. They're intertwined. And so we're all trying to sort out how quickly we can work through this crisis, this healthcare crisis, and what vaccinations and diagnostics and testing and treatment, what does that look like over the horizon, and how can we accelerate that process so we get back to business?
So Tim, does that suggest that the S rather than the E is the priority at the moment? This was a message that came through in our last Korean meeting in June, that for sovereign wealth funds and big pension funds like NPS or Korea Investment, you know, at the moment, we need to function, you know, focus on S. You know, your members are both private sector and public sector. You know, how do people think about what is the appropriate role for private capital? What is the appropriate role for public capital?
Sure. Well, the ESG matrix or framework is one that we certainly are spending a lot of time on. My colleague Sonia, who's here, is leading that exercise for us. And there isn't a conversation that I have with the C-suites of our member firms that the ESG matrix isn't a part of that conversation. And certainly the S piece has been a front and center over the last 6 or 7 months. As you know, you have to remember, this is a human crisis. This is a pandemic. And we have to remember those who are suffering, you know, either directly or indirectly. And we can talk about the direct nature or indirect nature of the impact of this crisis. But, you know, the environmental piece really didn't fall off. It's sort of been overshadowed a bit by the headlines of the pandemic. But the environmental piece and sustainability and climate is really quite active, as my colleague will attest. We're spending a tremendous amount of our time in using this time to focus on what I think is really a coming acceleration in the world, and hopefully the US's response to climate change, and how we can be a part of the solution to addressing climate change.
I should just tell the audience that we are having this conversation. It's Thursday morning in Asia, and we still don't know who the president in the United States is, which makes it difficult to talk about the prospect for US leadership. You know, Sonia, as you reach out to members, is there a sense that the private sector has to bear more of the burden, precisely because so many governments, and it doesn't break down on emerging market, developed market, have not had the resources or the inclination to rise to the occasion as much as one might have hoped?
I do think that one of the things that COVID has instilled is a sense of the need for collaboration, right? Need to work together. I mean, there is no way, as you say, with the massive increase in global debt levels over the past decade or so, there is no way that the public sector can take on all of the responsibility in financing sustainable development goals. The private sector really needs to be part of that solution. Another feature, I think, of the COVID landscape, one wants to say post-COVID, but we're really not there yet, has
Sadly.
been greater attention not only to the kind of social issues that you mentioned, but also moving beyond environment or beyond climate into sort of environmental factors, much broader factors like biodiversity, like natural capital. So you're starting to see, in terms of the private sector, a sense that the private sector needs to be responsible not only for sort of broad financial intermediation and support for climate goals, but to support biodiversity, to support natural capital, and to help cope with the debt problems and debt sustainability challenges that are being faced by so many countries, including low-income, climate and vulnerable countries. It's a very difficult position.
So how concerned are you about the increasing burden of debt, both on companies and countries? And how much do you anticipate that we'll see a liquidity crisis turn into a solvency crisis, despite the fact that the world is experiencing very, very low to negative interest rates?
Right. So I think, having that cushion there is certainly helpful, but the risk of probably not systemic crisis, but trouble spots has really increased simply because you have a very unsustainable equation, as it were. You have great uncertainty and clouds over future revenues. This is particularly the case for many emerging markets and low-income countries, where you have a hit to export revenues, you have lower remittances, you have lower tourism revenues, and it's really not clear when those are going to come back. So you have a hit to revenues at the same time that you have these high debt levels that have been built up. So servicing and maintaining that debt under these circumstances is going to be very difficult, and you are going to have problems. And this is really capturing the attention of public policymakers, how to resolve these problems.
Tim, when Sonia and I were chatting 2 days ago, one of the points that Sonia made was that you have the paradox of the demonstrable need for collaboration, but at the same time, many of your members who come from the official sector, think in terms of the nation, and many of your members who are private sector financial institutions have a more global perspective. Does that complicate things? How concerned are you about these different perspectives and the fact that perhaps unfairly, some of the politicians think in terms of election cycles in the US? How many politicians think in terms of 2-year, while financial institutions tend to have a longer term perspective?
Henny, you hit on one of the big challenges we face. If you think about the pandemic, it is a global crisis. It requires a global, integrated, collective solution. Climate change is a global problem, requires a global solution. The economic impact of both of those phenomena is global in nature and requires a global solution. So many of the issues that we have to confront today exist well beyond our boundaries. And unfortunately, over the past 4 to 8 years, many of our countries have moved away from the kind of multilateralism and collective action that was so predominant in the post-war era. That build all these institutions that have been so important in creating growth and prosperity, and frankly worries me. But to your point, our members are global in scope. They have presence in 100 countries, and so they have to operate globally. And in many ways, they think more globally than the political capital. So it gives us a great vantage
more
point.
global and more long term.
Of course, and so I think in many ways they are a real part of the solution. On climate change, for example, many of our firms are leading providing thought leadership in jurisdictions like the U.S., where the political process is still very far behind where it needs to be, given the science and actually given where public opinion is.
The FT did an ESG conference recently, and we did it out of Singapore, and Ravi Menon, the head of the MAS, gave the keynote. And he said something that I often hear from the insurance companies, and it's something that Sonja also touched on, which is the way to think about ESG is as a kind of risk management. I wondered, and Sonja had said to me, climate risk is financial risk, it's social risk. Do you think enough institutions have that awareness? Either of you.
I think that, Sonja, go right ahead. You are certainly leading on this issue.
No, I think, there's never enough, right, Henny? I mean, I think that, but what we're seeing, I think, across the board with our members and throughout the financial services industry is a tremendous effort to incorporate kind of ESG considerations across their business strategy. I think without exception, all of the CEOs that Tim spoke to at our annual meetings, all of the members of our sustainable finance working groups, they're all working toward the same goal, which interestingly enough, I think has been well documented in academic studies, for example, that firms that do this effectively end up building stronger connections in the different parts of their firm, thinking more holistically, thinking longer term, and ultimately proving to be more successful. So I think it's an ongoing process, and sure, okay, not enough firms are quite there yet, but a very important one, and one that we see tremendous momentum in.
So one of the things that IIF has been the real catalyst for is to work, on agreements about how do you measure it, what should the standards be, talking about the need for transparency and disclosure. How satisfied are you with progress towards standardization and the way to measure and corporate disclosure and transparency on ESG?
Well, I'll start, and then I know Sonja has some specific thoughts on this. Look, I think we're at the very beginning of what's going to be a long process. We have a very highly fragmented system, and each jurisdiction is sort of evolving and ripening at its own pace. And part of our job at the IIF is to create the connective tissue across those different jurisdictions so that we can ultimately bring about greater harmonization, greater consistency. I heard it repeatedly during our board meeting, CEOs and chairmen of these companies saying, look, I can't abide by 18 different systems. I need a system. Imagine having a dozen different accounting systems globally rather than 2. So it really is, there's enormous pressure to homogenize and make consistent. And we're doing that. Certain jurisdictions like the US are a little behind other places like Europe, and then obviously some of the announcements out of Asia, which I think are quite exciting. But that's our raison d'etre for the foreseeable future is to bring these various elements together: consistency, standardization, and harmonization.
You know, you referred to this part of the world, Asia. You came out with a very interesting report on China a few weeks ago, and you talked about the fact that China needs, you know, Chinese companies, which tend to be state-owned, need to have more disclosure. You know, in China, you know, the threat of climate change and the need to deal with it is clearly a top-down government thing. We've had China announce carbon-free by 2060.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for countries like Korea, you know, acid rain from China was a huge problem not long ago because of coal. To what extent, given the uncertainty about the US, can China be a leader in being the catalyst for climate change and leading the initiative? Right after China said 2060, we had the Japanese and the Koreans saying 2050 for us.
Henny, as I said before, climate change is a global problem. It requires a global solution. And the principal players have to be the US and Europe and China and South Korea and Japan, and both as emitters and also as the providers of capital and technological solution. China has to be a part of it. It will be a part of it. And so, you know, you mentioned the political dynamics here in the US, irrespective of who's president and irrespective of trade tensions, climate change has to be a part of the discourse, of the discussions, whoever is president here in the United States, along with President Xi. We cannot solve this individually. It has to be collective action. And as far as disclosure is concerned, you know, I believe capital is a coward. It goes where it's treated well and flees where it's treated badly. If you want capital, if you want to attract capital, you've got to have transparency. You've got to disclose, because capital can go a lot of places. And I think just sheer market forces are going to force greater visibility, greater transparency. You know, investors want to know what they're buying, and ultimately we'll see an adherence to a much more rigorous regime.
And Henny, if I could just jump in there quickly on the point about need for more disclosure in the Chinese corporate sector. I mean, you know, Tim said it, climate change is a global problem, and so is climate disclosure, right? And China is by no means alone here. I think that the challenge is not only making sure companies have the right data, the right tools to be able to disclose appropriately, but also making sure we kind of all speak the same language on disclosure, right? So
Exactly.
if Chinese firms are reporting their risks in one way, which is different to how they're being reported in Korea, how they're reported in the US and Europe, it'll never work. Global investors will never have that comparability. Yeah, we really do.
You know, Henny, Sonia reminded me, I always allude to, it's like food labeling. So if you go to the grocery store and you can look at this box of cereal or that box of cereal, you know how many calories and how much fat grams and trans, you can make comparisons because we standardize and we measure what goes in, you know, those various products. And we have to have the same sort of simplistic and transparent mindset for something like these products, certainly for those at the retail level.
You said something very interesting to me the other day, which is you need an appropriate speed for the transition to a more green world, which means not too slow, but also not too quickly, right? I wonder if you could talk about that for a minute. And then I want to turn to technology and all the opportunities.
You know, I think one of the things we see at the IIF, we've got something like half our membership comes from emerging markets, or I could say so-called emerging markets, because there are so many different stages of development. It's really not right to label them all as a homogeneous group. They're all very different. But one thing that many emerging and developing economies have in common is a very carbon-dependent growth model. And each country has its own set of circumstances. And therefore, you know, the imperative for this transition, you know, it's like maybe gospel in many parts of the developed world, right? Oh, transition, yes, we have to get to transition, we have to get net zero. there's certainly the same understanding, the same awareness of the need for transition in emerging markets, but you run up against hard practical realities. You know, I remember talking to the CEO of a bank in South Africa who said something like, I look out my window, on one side I see climate protesters. On the other side, I see people protesting the lack of jobs and unemployment. You can't really square that circle easily. And there's no simple answer to this. So transition is going to happen at different speeds in different places, and global policy on climate needs to take that into account.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to turn now in the final minutes of our chat to technology. You know, I spend a lot of time in India. There are so many new billionaires in India who have gotten into renewable space. You know, a few years ago, we all thought that the transition to green would involve huge trade-offs, right? But renewable energy costs have come down so much. Can you both talk about the opportunities, you know, that technology is making possible?
Sure, I'll start and then I'll have Sonia give us her thoughts too. You know, interestingly, if you look over the past decade, carbon emissions per unit of growth in the US has dropped. And why is that? It's because of efficiency and the application of new technologies and the movement to non-fossil fuels. In fact, I saw a CEO of an energy company just 2 days ago. He said, we used to have 70% of our energy was from coal, and now 70% is from renewables and gas. So it goes back to the transition issue. The price of renewable energy per kilowatt hour, BTUs, is dropping and dropping precipitously. So technology is a big part of the solution for us going to a zero carbon based world by mid-century. And we should do everything we can to sort of all the above approach and provide funding for whatever promising technologies are out there. Sonia?
I would only add that I think in terms of moving the financial sector along as a channel of funding, the existence of these many new technologies in so many different areas, in so many different contexts, think of sort of smart infrastructure. I was learning about a webinar on smart agriculture the other day, and the banks that fund these really cool sort of remote veterinarian facilities. So I think it's a way to broaden the focus. I mean, with climate issues, you have the risk side of things, which is a huge push for the financial sector, right? The regulators are pushing them hard to understand and report and manage climate risk. But the opportunity side is immense. And I think as hearts and minds in the US turn more to the need to finance climate goals, this is going to be tremendously appealing and offer huge opportunities for firms all over the world.
I think on that optimistic note, we'll end. I want to thank you both so much and look forward to us all having a reunion in Seoul sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Henny. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Henny.